Hi, I'm Rebecca Fischer. I'm a postdoc in mineral sciences, and the Earth has a core. So the core is a giant sphere of metal sitting at the center of our planet. It's completely inaccessible. We will never be able to get any samples from it, and so we don't fully know what it's made of. That's the subject of my talk today. What we do know is that we have a solid inner core surrounded by a liquid outer core, and that's overlain by a solid rocky mantle made up mostly of silicate minerals. And we also know from information like the Earth's mass, moment of inertia, and seismology that the core is very large and very dense. It's about a third of the mass of the Earth. Much of what we know about the core's composition comes from cosmochemistry. So it's been understood for a while now that the core is mostly made of iron with some nickel in there also. And this comes from looking at things like primitive meteorites, which represent the leftover building blocks of the Earth, and from looking at the spectrum of the sun, which is the bulk composition of the solar system. And we see very high abundances of iron and nickel in both of these places. But we know that that's not the whole story. So in this figure, I'm showing density as a function of pressure, which you can think of as depth within the Earth. And we're going from the top of the core on the left to the center of the Earth on the right. This bottom curve is the seismologically observed density structure of the Earth's core, and this top curve is the experimentally determined density of iron under the same pressures and temperatures measured in a laboratory. You can see that there's about a 10% difference in density here. So this means that there must be something else in the core, and it must be something less dense than iron. So the leading candidates for some of these so-called light elements are silicon, oxygen, sulfur, carbon, and hydrogen. And it's important to understand both the identities and abundances of these light elements because they tell us something about how the core formed and how the Earth formed more generally and what it's made of. They play a key role in the generation of the Earth's magnetic field that shields us from radiation from space. And they dictate the thermal structure of the core, which in turn affects the entire heat engine of the Earth. So to better understand what these light elements in the core might be, I do experiments where I recreate the process of core formation in the laboratory. I use microscopic samples that are mixtures of iron metal, core analogs, and silicate rock, mantle analogs. And I use a device called a diamond Anvil cell, shown here on the left, and I also brought one for show and tell, so you can see how big it is. We compress the sample between the tips of these two diamonds right there, and in this study we generated pressures into the Earth's lower mantle, so up to 1 million atmospheres of pressure. And then while the sample is being held at these pressures, we bring in infrared lasers from each side and heat it up to very high temperatures, in this study up to 5,700 Kelvin. So while we have this microscopic sample at these very high pressures and temperatures, the metal and the rock are undergoing chemical reactions. And in particular, we're interested in looking at how the silicon and the oxygen move from the rock into the metal, because that might explain how they got into the core in the first place. So after we run these experiments, we recover our sample down to ambient conditions. We open up the diamond cell and take it out. We cut a thin slice through the sample using a focused ion beam, and then we analyze it chemically using a transmission electron microscope to see how much silicon and oxygen have moved from the rocky material into the metal, and we then can parameterize this data as a function of pressure and temperature. And so once we have this sort of parameterization of the data, we can use it to model how much silicon and oxygen should be in the Earth's core today. So on the left, I'm showing the evolution of silicon and oxygen in the Earth's core in one of our model runs. So the silicon and oxygen are increasing as the Earth is growing. And on the right is a histogram showing the results of all of the models that we ran. So we find it's most likely that the Earth's core contains about 5.5 weight% silicon and about 2 weight% oxygen. So we were really excited by this result because it's almost enough light element in the core to match the observed density, which was about a 10% deficit. But there's still a little bit of room for something else in there. And it's important that we understand what this something else might be because it could affect the behavior of silicon and oxygen. So we might have a non-unique solution here. So in my work here at the museum, I'm focusing on the possibility of carbon being in the core. Carbon's a really important element. It's critical for life on the Earth's surface, helps to regulate climate, it's important in volcanism, and it may also be important in the core. So we want to understand how much carbon is in the bulk Earth and how it got there and when and from where it was delivered. So if there were 2 weight percent carbon in the core, hypothetically, this would be 90% of Earth's carbon in the core. That would mean we're only seeing 10% of it. So if we want to know how much carbon is in the bulk Earth, we have to know how much is in the core. So experiments done at low pressures and temperatures have shown that carbon prefers the core-forming materials to the rocky materials, but this has never been studied before at the pressures and temperatures relevant to the inside of the Earth. So since I've been here at the museum, I've been running experiments to look at this, similar to the experiments I just described for silicon and oxygen, only we've added a little bit of carbon to the system. And we create a sort of miniature Earth in our experiment. So here's a picture of one here. We have a metallic sphere at the center, and it's surrounded by our rocky mantle. We've run 8 experiments like this and prepped them for further chemical analyses that are going to take place in the next couple of months. But preliminarily, we can see that carbon still prefers to go into the metal at these very high pressures and temperatures. So what is the core made of? We've long known that it's mostly an iron-nickel alloy. My earlier work showed that silicon and oxygen are likely, and the work I'm doing here at the museum shows that there's a role for carbon too. And I'd like to just end by acknowledging my NSF postdoctoral fellowship, Liz Cottrell and Tim Gooding at the museum, and various other collaborators. Thanks.
Does the presence of these light elements in the core have any effect on the magnetic field?
The question was, do these light elements affect the magnetic field? Very much so. They're about half of the energy source that's driving the magnetic field in the core. So the core is generated by convection of the liquid outer core, and these light elements moving around in that outer core provide about half of the energy that drives the dynamo.
And Rebecca, Earth's core, I mean, that's big. How did you go down that path?
So I started my research career here at the museum as a summer intern as an undergrad. And I started that working on very shallow samples from the upper mantle of the Earth. And basically, in the research I've been doing since then, I've just been gradually moving deeper and deeper within the Earth until I've gotten to the core, and now I can't go any deeper.
Question about the future of Earth's core. Can you say something about that for the next billion years?
The question's about the future of the Earth's core, like in the next billion years.
Yeah, so basically what's happening is the Earth's core is cooling off slowly over time. It has residual heat from when the Earth formed, and it's gradually losing that heat. So as the core is cooling, the solid inner core is growing out of the liquid outer core. It's crystallizing out of the liquid. So eventually what's going to happen is that there's not enough liquid left to drive the magnetic field, and we're going to lose that magnetic field. Eventually the whole core will harden, but this will take maybe a few billions of years.
So we're not in any danger.
No, we're good for now.
What about radioactivity helping to generate heat?
So that's another really hot topic in our community right now. The problem is, the question was if radioactivity could be a heat source in the Earth. So it's a very important heat source in the crust and the mantle, but the experiments that we're doing are showing that these elements don't ever like to really go into the metal that forms the core. You have to go to extremely high pressures and temperatures, and then you don't really even get enough to provide a real energy source.